All right, let's look at number 31. In number 31, we have 1/5 the sign, and then this funky set of parentheses where we have 8 times the quantity x minus 3 pi over 2, and all that minus 4. Now, some people got confused because they wondered, do I multiply everything by 8 here? What do we do with that 8? Well, if you remember from the notes, there were times where we had a coefficient with the x that wasn't 1, and so we had to factor that out, and that was just one extra step. So I've already done that step for you here, so you don't have to worry about doing that. We've already separated that 8 from the rest. Now, just trying to look at that equation and trying to come up with the period, or the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, the vertical shift, that's a big jump to make. And just like if you were to try to cross a river, sometimes you can't make it across a river, so you have to maybe throw some stepping stones to get across. Well, that's what we're going to do with writing down what the translation and scale change, what the rule for the translation and scale change would be, because then we'll be able to pull it apart from there and make it a little bit more manageable. Now, you got to remember that a translation is going to be any time we add or subtract in our equation, and the scale change is any time we multiply or divide in our equation. So let's start with the translation. So I'm going to look at that equation, and anytime I see any adding or subtracting, that's what I'm going to focus on. So let's start with the x. So here we have x minus 3 pi over 2. So when we're working with the x, remember we do the opposite. So the opposite of that would be x plus 3 pi over 2. And that minus 4, we would just leave it as it is, except for we would write it as y minus 4, meaning this graph is moving to the right 3 pi over 2 radians, and it's moving down 4 units. Now let's go to the scale change. Remember, here we're looking for any multiplying or dividing. Now, looking at the x, yeah, there's nothing happening with the x right away, but we could multiply 8 times x. Or you could think of it as, let's ignore the minus 3 pi over 2, and we would have 8x. So when we go to the rule, we do the opposite. So we could say x divided by 8, or 1/8 x. And that 1/5 that's in front of the sign, that's what's going to happen vertically. So it's going to be shrunk vertically to be 1/5 the size. So remember the amplitude we get from our b value, which is 1/5, so our amplitude is 1/5. Now to find our period, this is the only piece that we have to do any work. We have to take 2 pi times that a value, which is 1/8. Well, 2 pi times 1/8 is 2 pi over 8, and that reduces to pi over 4. So our period would be pi over 4 radians. Our phase shift, that's our horizontal shift, so that's moving to the right 3 pi over 2 radians, so you can just say 3 pi over 2. Our vertical shift is moving down 4 units, or we could just write it as -4. So that's how we can find those specific pieces to an equation. So again, I would start by, even though it's not going to ask you to find the rule for the translation of the scale change, I really think that's a good place to start.